So I'm going to hand it over to Jack, and Jack's going to take it away tonight, talking about Knoxville cuisine.
All right, thanks a lot, Paul. Appreciate it, and thanks everybody for coming out. We're of course in Thanksgiving season next week, and maybe an unusual and maybe the strangest Thanksgiving of our lives. But next week will be Thanksgiving with I hope mostly small groups of one in some cases. But we'll celebrate it anyway, as they did in 1863. That was the year that Abraham Lincoln first declared that Thanksgiving was a national holiday. And that means a lot to Knoxville, because guess what was happening at Thanksgiving in 1863? It was a city that was surrounded by hostile Confederate troops, almost 20,000 of them surrounding the city, cutting it off from lots of things, including food. So they were on half rations when the soldiers got the order from Burnside that hey, it's Thanksgiving next Thursday, you need to celebrate it somehow. So they celebrated with half rations, whereas one historian put it half rations of food and full rations of bullets. So it was an unusual, inauspicious beginning to Thanksgiving, perhaps in Knoxville, except that it wasn't really the beginning of Thanksgiving here, because we had celebrated Thanksgiving back in the 1850s. And ironically, if you want to call it that, it was in 1855 when the guy who was 10 years later Abraham Lincoln's vice president, Andrew Johnson, was governor of Tennessee. In 1855, he declared that Thanksgiving would be celebrated in Tennessee not in November for whatever reason, but on December 6th. And Knoxville duly obliged with one giant church service at the old Presbyterian church downtown. All the denominations came together in that one, I think the largest church auditorium there was in town at the time, to celebrate Thanksgiving. And other people heard holiday, and they did what they do on holidays, and they blew off firecrackers. So it became a kind of every year a battle between hymn singing and firecrackers going off outside at the same time. But anyway, it's an interesting, all holiday histories are interesting, and how they've evolved. But in magazines, I was a magazine journalist for many years, and Thanksgiving was always an excuse to have a food issue and talk about food and foodways and food culture. And that's what we're going to be talking about tonight: Knoxville cuisine. And does it exist? Do we have anything like Cincinnati chili or Nashville hot chicken or Philly cheesesteaks? And a lot of cities have some signature dish, and I'm going to get to that and whether Knoxville has something like that or not in a little bit. Do we have anything here that's unique about our cuisine that you don't find so much in other cities? And when I'm done, I'd like to hear from your ideas about this. I'd like to hear your memories about restaurants and recipes and dishes that you've had here that may be unusual and perhaps even unique to Knoxville. A quick background on our history. Our earliest history in food goes back to the 1790s, when we had taverns downtown, and many travelers were coming through, including a good many travelers from Europe. And the first restaurant review I've ever been able to find was written by a guy who was later the citizen king of France. Louis Philippe was here in 1797, and he wrote his review just in his diary. It was published after his death, but he wrote about Knoxville: "The common board where we are obliged to take our meals is not bad." So that's it could be worse. Early Knoxville restaurants, he might have been at Chisholm's Tavern or one of the other taverns downtown, but he thought it was really not bad, which is something for a Frenchman to say about frontier food in 1797. In the early years, of course, African-American culture was always part of our Knoxville culture, and there's some references in the early days, sometimes through the work of George Washington Harris, the humorist and fiction writer, who referred to Aunt Edie's cakes and beer. Aunt Edie was believed to be an African-American woman who was known for her cakes and at least in Harris's memories, for the beer that she served with it. I've tried to figure out who Aunt Edie was. There was an Aunt Edie Edwards who ran a restaurant on what's now South Central a few years later, and I wonder if she's the same person. But another African-American early restaurateur, food vendor was a guy named Alfred Anderson, who may have been one of our first purveyors of ice cream. These aren't what you think of as soul food, cakes and ice cream, but they were early Black people who were selling these things in the streets of Knoxville. Um, why should there be a culinary culture here? We are proud of our musical culture and our literary culture. Is there a reason that we should expect that there should be a distinct culinary culture? Well, there might be. Market Square, and this the picture we're looking at right now. We'll get back to this later, the Biltmore Cafe, but just around this corner from the Biltmore Cafe is Market Square, and the old market house, which was kind of a. By the way, here's a. Speaking back to Thanksgiving, this is a great early ad for Thanksgiving foods. This was let's go back to the Hudabergs ad, Paul. At Thanksgiving, the turkey came into the fore in the 1870s, but Hudabergs was an interesting place downtown that sold turkeys dressed and alive. So if you wanted to kill your turkey yourself or just keep it as a pet, Hudaberg would sell it to you. Cranberries and mincemeat, these things are still part of the Thanksgiving traditions, but also a good many imported things: California pears, New York and Malaga grapes, Florida oranges, lemons and apples, magnolia hams, and beef tongues. I've only had beef tongues at Mexican restaurants. That's kind of fallen out of the Thanksgiving tradition. But also bananas, coconuts, and prunes. This was in 1877 that people could buy this on Market Square. These kind of exotic imported things that came in on the trains: raisins and figs, cooked corned beef, and breakfast bacon, cream cheese, and fresh crackers. Some people used to have told me that cream cheese was an exotic thing that came in the mid 20th century, but they had something called cream cheese at least in 1877. Pickles and sauerkraut. We spell sauerkraut differently, but that was maybe reflecting the German heritage. But plum pudding, canned fruits and vegetables at Hudaberg's, the Market Square grocer. By the way, Hudaberg sounds like a German name, but actually it was a family of French origin. They originally they spelled their name differently. I think it's Hudaburg was with their original name. But they were a family that had kind of come out of the Bearden area. We talk about the Hudabergs in the Bearden book that we just published, but the Hudabergs were based mainly in Bearden for years, and this particular Hudaberg moved into town and ran a grocery in downtown at Market Square. But anyway, I just ran across this today, and I'm glad we got to run it. But yeah, back to the Market Square image. Market Square was established in 1854 and developed a reputation as one of the most. It was actually called the best market for food between Norfolk and New Orleans. Norfolk, Virginia, on the coast, and New Orleans down the Gulf, and in between was Knoxville and Market Square. It was a place where you could buy almost anything. There were farmers would come there from not just from the Knoxville area. There were farmers from the Smoky Mountains and up in Anderson County and other places who sold on Market Square. But farmers sometimes came from other states. I once interviewed Charlie Leuven, the bluegrass legend, who he said he was first familiar with Knoxville in the 1930s as a little kid. He and his father would come here to sell sorghum in Market Square. They said it was the best market for sorghum in the Southeast, and they would travel. It was a couple-day trip in those days to come to Knoxville, to come here just to spend a week or two selling sorghum on Market Square. And other farmers came from as far away as Kentucky and North Carolina and other places, but it had almost everything you could think of. Market Square, it was almost anything edible. Not just these regional farmers, but they also had seafood and imported things, as you've seen at the Hudaberg's ad, and people like Louis Lipner, who was, I think, the longest termed Market Square vendor in its history. I don't know of any vendor who was there longer than Louis Lipner. he had a place inside. He was from Vienna, Austria, and he was a kosher butcher and fishmonger in the market house. And he had a kosher and a non-kosher side of his market. You could buy anything from him. He would show you how to prepare things kosher if you wanted to. But just a fascinating variety of people were in there. I love the description that Market Square was the most democratic place on earth. He said only there do the rich and the poor, black and white people jostle each other in perfect equality. Because if you wanted to make a good meal for your family, you had to go to Market Square. It's where you bought everything. There was nothing comparable in the region to a Market Square for food. So it was kind of not just locally, but regionally famous, this place, as a source for food. But Knoxville, also another thing that makes you think it might have something culinarily distinctive, is that it had an interesting mix of Irish, Germans, and French, and French Swiss and German Swiss people here, and who collectively brought a new demand for beer, for one thing. But a lot of other food traditions. The Irish town, for example, the old Irish community had its own bakery and its own way of cooking the food that it liked, and people preferred to live in Irish town partly because they didn't like American food. They stayed in their community. But also especially German cuisine. We had a great many refugees for the German revolutions of 1848. Who came over here, and this was they brought their own foodways, especially having to do with German cuisine, German sausages. If you go to Market Square today, you'll see a place over on in the left side of this picture, on the west side of the square. The only legible word on a building in Market Square today is the word Ziegler. And Ziegler was a sausage maker. He was with a couple of guys named Mettler and Fans, who were both German-speaking immigrants as well. And they went in together as a trio and made sausage. They weren't the only sausage makers in town or in the square. It was there was another guy named Paul Macher. I may mention him later, who was kind of extravagant in his sausage presentation. But also in this picture on the left, the building that to the far left of the picture in this old postcard is the Kern building. It was built by Peter Kern, the baker. He was not just a baker. A lot of us remember Kern's bread. It was not too long ago. In fact, there's still a Kern's brand out of Virginia now. But I grew up on Kern's bread baked here in Knoxville. But he also he made ice cream. He had a small ice cream factory in there, and he was also a candy maker. He claimed to be the biggest candy maker in the Southeast, all in that one building. It was quite a lot going on there. But there were, Knoxville, surprisingly to some people, for about 50 or 60 years, was a major candy center. That from the Civil War era to the early 20th century, there were several competing candy factories in town, including Kern's, including Kuhlman's, including the Spiro brothers, who were from Hungary. They also made ice cream. And Littlefield and Steer, if you know the candy factory on the World's Fair Park that was redone for the World's Fair. That was the Littlefield and Steer factory. That was probably our biggest candy factory, and it was there for several decades, producing candy up until the Depression. But the food industry is another reason that we had a reason to think there might be something to look for culinarily in Knoxville. One thing especially is flour. The White Lily company was founded by J. Allen Smith in 1885. He built a flour mill that made lots of different kinds of flour. But in fact, I think at one time he had 30 or 40 different kinds of flour that he made. But the best known by far over the years became White Lily, and it was called the J. Allen Smith factory for a long time. But after a while, they said, everybody knows this is White Lily. This is called the White Lily flour factory. And they made in that one building, the darker building on the right, they made White Lily flour for 120 years in that one building. Of course, the factory expanded a good deal over the years. And I think they did a lot of the production in later years and the expanded part. But that building, I'm glad to say, is still there. I'm sorry to say it, that White Lily moved to the Midwest about 15 years ago, but their flour business. After the flour had become really famous nationally here, that it's been called for in some cookbooks published in New York and touted as one of the best flours for cakes and biscuits and other things. But that's now the White Lily Lofts, so that's now a residential building. But later we had lots of industrial sized food factories. I'm glad to say JFG Coffee is still here, although it's moved down over to Sutherland Avenue. It used to be it was downtown for many years, made downtown smell like coffee, which was okay with me for most of my youth here. But also meat packers. We had 3 big meat packers. Armour and Swift were national and had just local factories here, but also Lay's, which was a local meat packer, and a couple of others. But it was East Tennessee and Selecto and all that. But we had that going on here as well. We had a generally an interesting ethnic mix that we sometimes overlook when we exaggerate kind of our vague British or Scots-Irish roots in East Tennessee. But there were a good many Greek immigrants in the food business in these early days, beginning with a guy in 1899 whose real name was probably Konstantinos Koustoulis, according to one scholar who's looked into it. We knew him as Bob Alexander. Alexander is a sufficiently Greek name, I guess, and that's what he answered to. But he sold sandwiches out of a push cart downtown on South Central. But other Greek families, the Gorgas Cavaleris, Antignos, Cronus, Kapitonopolis, Perulis, and of course Regas families were all along the way in there, kind of specializing in sandwiches and cafe food. Also, some Italians were involved. Mike Armetta was kind of famous regionally for his ice cream. Mike Armetta was worked out of the old Sullivan Saloon in the 20s and 30s and 40s, and our whole Armetta family was in ice cream, and people would from miles around would come to Armetta to provide Italian ice cream to them. But the Provenza family, they had a sandwich shop on South Central too. South Central is the one place you would hear the Italian language in East Tennessee, probably, except for in La Follette, where there were some Italians as well. But also the Marmara and Ribori families were fruit vendors. And there were African American establishments in this polyglot area down by the railroad station. There was a place that I've seen described in 1900 that an African American restaurant that sold boiled pork, cabbage, fried fish, chicken, and ham, varied according to the season, by an occasional dish of pig's feet and similar delicacies. That was right on First Creek, a place right on First Creek. It was a place built out of rough boards. It sold whiskey, brandy, and beer, and it boasts of a small string orchestra. I would love to know what kind of music they played at that restaurant bar. But there was another option from this time from a guy named Harry Royston, who was a circus carney, arrived here in 1887. He brought us something new and exotic that I want to talk about later. We owe a great debt to Harry Royston. But anyway, during this time, there were also some interesting exotic restaurants that started popping up. And by the late 19th century, we got kind of curious about different kinds of food, except other than just the basic stuff that Mom used to make, kind of the biscuits and ham and that sort of thing that we were used to making in East Tennessee. One was our first French restaurant, and it was in a place called the Vendôme, kind of a place that's out of a dream almost. It was a hotel and an apartment building that was on Clinch Avenue. And does this even look real to you? It was real. It shows up in some aerial pictures of downtown. It was on Clinch Avenue, at Walnut Street, and just a fascinating, beautiful building. That was built in 1890. A lot of well-known people. I've been doing some research into Eugenia Williams, who lived on Lions View. Her parents lived in this building for a while. Tennessee Williams, the playwright Tennessee Williams' grandfather lived in this building for a while in the 1890s. But it had a up on the top on, and I think it was right in that underneath that dome, that corner cupola. That was where there was a French restaurant, and they imported a French chef to come in and run the place. I would love to know more about it. I've never seen a menu for the Vendôme Cafe. But I would, if you all know of anything of the sort, I would love to see it or hear about it. And I really don't know how long it lasted, but we do know that it was during the 1890s that French style cuisine started catching on, and there was a bit of a social media sensation in the last week or so when Cindy Proto, who's helped provide us with many of our images, posted an image of a menu that she found of a fascinating place called Ferd Miller's Dining Room. Now, this has nothing to do with Miller's Department Store. It was there before Miller's Department Store, I think. But Ferd Miller is not just a funny spelling of Fred. Ferd is short for Ferdinand. Ferdinand Miller actually was one of these German refugees who came over after the revolutions of 1848. And here's just a sampling of this multi-page menu. Just look down the list there. They have Welsh rabbit and omelets, and kind of fancy sounding omelets with ham or tongue. Quail on toast, fried squirrels with country gravy, but also rabbit a la jardiniere, and stuffed squab. This was probably, believe it or not, in those days, squab was usually passenger pigeon, a bird that is now extinct, but once flew in great flocks over East Tennessee. Larded a la Bordelaise, and then next the item down is baked possum with sweet potatoes. So here you have a combination of country and French in one restaurant. I would like to know more about Miller's and how long this restaurant lasted. Anyway, I've made it a kind of a mission to look for the first of several kinds of restaurants, and I've been especially interested in the first, like the first ethnic, I guess we would call it, restaurants, the first non-American restaurants, first foreign cuisine restaurants, and one of the first is Italian cuisine, which we've had so long that we think of it as American. We'd had a pasta as early as the 1870s. There were places on Market Square that sold pasta back in the 1870s. But we didn't know what to do with it, and so the few Italians who moved here were kind of disgusted with what Americans did with pasta. They cooked it till it's completely tasteless, and just mixed it with chicken or something like that. But a guy named Tom Provenza, who ran a cafe down on South Central, actually offered lessons in cooking pasta and not cooking it too long. It was just his public service, I think, to help Americans learn how to cook pasta. He ran a confectionery, by the way. There's a great story that I found when I was researching the Old City book about Frank Provenza, and I think he was from Sicily, and he had his cafe, his confectionery cafe, and he was next door to a cafe that was run by Greeks, the Gorgas family, and I think he brought his father over. His father, like a lot of older immigrants, they never learned English. They just moved here and did as well as they could. But his father came over, spoke only Italian and some English, but then the Greek family brought over their mother, whose name is Oriana. She came over. She spoke only Greek. She spoke no Italian or English. But she made friends with Mr. Provenza, and they would sit out on every morning. She would make a pot of coffee from her cafe, and they would sit out on the street together. They didn't understand each other, but they both understood coffee, and they both saw things on South Central that amused them. Bert Vincent, the great News Sentinel columnist, got to meet them in the late 1930s and wrote a column about them. One of the most heart charming columns of that era. But here's the first real Italian restaurant. There was there had been a guy named Levi Pellegrini, who was a marble worker. This is one issue to talk about. There were several different kinds of Italian people. People came here for different reasons. And there was a whole wave in the early 20th century of Italian marble workers who wanted to come here to work with Tennessee marble. And one was a guy named Levi Pellegrini, who worked here, was a marble worker. His wife announced plans in 1930 that she was going to open an Italian restaurant in Knoxville, and she said she had 75 recipes. But she was kind of slow getting the restaurant off the ground. She finally did open what she called the Italian dining room on Atlantic Avenue, where they lived up in Lincoln Park. And I don't know how many of the 75 recipes she offered there, but she had certain hours that she just said, come in and tell us what you want, and we'll make it for you. But before she got to open her place, another marble worker named Telesfero Jan, Y-O-N. That doesn't sound like an Italian name. They were from the northern part of Italy, near the Swiss border, but they were nonetheless Italian. They spoke Italian, had Italian recipes, Italian culture. But Telesfero Jan came here originally to help build the Weston Fulton mansion on Lies View, which had a lot of marble in it. And he stayed here when there was another really big, even more massive job for marble, and that was the Church Street Methodist Church on Henley Street, when they were building that great monument that's still there on Henley Street. He got work there. He was planning to move on to some other place after Fulton, but he heard about this other thing, and then worked for a couple of years on the Methodist Church, and just ended up spending the rest of his life here working on marble jobs here. But his wife, Maria, had her own ideas. She opened a restaurant on Cumberland Avenue at the corner of 20th Street and Cumberland Avenue, and her name was Maria Jan. She opened this place in March of 1932, and here's one of their early ads: the original and only Italian restaurant in Knoxville, Mrs. Jan's Spaghetti Shop, on National Highway number 70. But it's has her phone number, and told her generally and homemade products. And look at what she served: Italian food like spaghetti, ravioli, meatballs, minestrone, antipasto, veal cutlets, breaded pork chops, salads, chili, biscuit tortoni, spumoni. You probably have this like an Italian ice cream dish, and Italian chop suey and chow mein. These chop suey and chow mein were becoming extremely popular. They're a very trendy new dish at that time. And I don't care what kind of ethnic restaurant you were running, or what kind of American, whatever, what domestic restaurant or international or whatever, you were tempted by selling some chop suey and chow mein. The Jazz Age brought this in as kind of a late night dish that it was just fun to eat. Chop suey and chow mein. People didn't know about any other kind of Chinese dish, but they served that. And for people who say that this wasn't authentic, it was often made by Chinese people, and they made their own versions of it. And it's kind of a not very limited idea. And basically, you could say the chop suey or chow mein describes most Chinese dishes. Just lots of chopped up little pieces of meats and vegetables with a sauce on rice or noodles, which is kind of describes most of what we eat in Chinese restaurants. But anyway, it's a fascinating place. I wish I could have been there. It was there for not a long time, 5 or 6 years, but that was our very first Italian restaurant. All right, the next image we have is of our first restaurant to advertise as a Chinese restaurant. It was the Pagoda, and it was at 807 South Gay Street. That was next to the Bijou Theater. Yes, that was exactly where the bistro is today. In fact, the tiles on the floor of the bistro, those dark red clay tiles, were laid down for the pagoda when they opened the pagoda in 1932. But this was a Chinese American restaurant. They had fried chicken and so forth, but they had an actual Chinese chef named Hui Yao, who had worked previously in Atlanta, who came here to run the pagoda. The pagoda was run by a couple of Jewish families, but it was as Chinese as you got in East Tennessee in those days. It was mainly they didn't want to scare anybody away by saying that they were all Chinese, so they did offer sandwiches and fried chicken, but they had chop suey and chow mein, which were the two Chinese dishes that Americans had heard of in 1932. And I would love to have known what Hui Yao's chop suey was like. But that was there for 5 or 6 years too. About the same period, it opened the same year as Jan's Spaghetti Shop, and lasted about the same period right in the middle of the Depression. But there are lots of stories about the pagoda, about people, various people who went there and what kind of trouble they got into when they were there. But it had a reputation for attracting gangsters at one time. But it has. But I would love to know more about that, and there's probably more about that to learn. If you know anything about the pagoda, if your grandparents had some memory about it, let me know about that. But I want to talk before we leave Chinese that there was another, just down the street, there was another guy named Ben Kwok, who was Chinese, kind of a Chinese intellectual. He ran a bookstore on Gay Street between 1934 and 1951, at the time of his rather sudden death of a heart attack. But he ran a bookstore, and a very interesting, kind of challenging bookstore with both Chinese and American titles. Ben Kwok was also a poet whose work was published in national Chinese magazines. But he, for a while, attempted to run a Chinese restaurant out of the back of his bookstore, just for special occasions. Kind of, he had a few tables in the back, and he would cook things as he knew how. But an interesting guy. He was actually involved in real estate and stuff when he lived in Knoxville as well. But later, a lot of people may remember, in fact, I remember this one, a restaurant, the first long-term Chinese restaurant that lasted more than 10 years was a place originally known as the New China Restaurant. It was on Clinch Avenue, and in the old 509 location, which had been a jazz club, one of Jack Comer's jazz clubs before that. But a guy named Joseph Poi and Kam Soon Lee leased that old nightclub and made a Chinese restaurant of it. And it was just a cool kind of classic urban Chinese restaurant that was there for quite a long time. What has all this tradition left us? I'm interested to think about what White Lily might have wrought. White Lily was still here when people started talking about having a biscuit festival here, and that led to the Southern Food Writers Conference. It was here for several years. Hope it'll come back someday. But white lily flour kind of was part of a baking tradition that we had here. Of course, curns we've already talked about, but do we have another picture of curns, Paul, or the what's our next slide? Oh yeah, here's a picture of the Greek restaurants, the Boston Cafe. There's one time that there were about 8 competing Greek-owned restaurants down on this one block of what we now know as the Old City. The Boston Cafe was one of them. Down the way was Manhattan's. It's interesting. There was another called Atlanta Cafe, another one called New York Cafe, that were all in this same area. They say that often the Greeks would name something after some aspect of their journey to where they ended up. So some of these Greeks might have lived in Boston before they came to Knoxville. They often named their cafes for another place in America, in another city in America where they might have lived. This actually is a picture out of my Old City book. I'd go into that in some detail, and there's some great descriptions of the Greek restaurants and as they were in the mid 1930s, thanks to a Greek journalist who came here and wrote a great, much detailed picture. Here's another picture just around the corner from that shot looking up Vine Street. This is the Cal Johnson building, a building owned by a guy, owned by a guy who was a former slave. But the New York Cafe is on the bottom floor, and that was another Greek-owned restaurant that was right there. They mainly served American food, but some of them had a reputation for accepting challenges. If you were from Syria and came to Knoxville and wanted something Syrian, they would try to fix it for you. There was one on Market Square, the Gold Sun, which had a special. It was open 24 hours a day, and had a special reputation for accepting challenges, because Market Square was right outside, and waiters could go out to the square and buy stuff to prepare your meal, no matter what you asked for. But anyway, that's a great old picture, and that I think Cal Johnson's office at one time was up in the second floor. But what's the next picture, Paul? All right, here's the I guess the best known Greek restaurant, the longest lived one, and that was the Regis Brothers Cafe, that started as something called the Ocean Cafe, but in 1919. But it was I mentioned the Greeks named things for some aspect of their journey to where they ended. But the Regis Cafe was originally a very small place, just a lunch counter type place. A lot of us remember the more luxurious restaurant with multiple rooms in the old hotel building where this restaurant was originally, but they kind of expanded over the years and took over rooms that had belonged to the hotel Watauga, where they were located. But they were there for almost 100 years in that same location, albeit much changed. I think it was the 1950s that they turned down the lights, and made it more romantic, more posh sort of a place with a more upscale menu. But they were just one of several Greek families originally that landed in this general neighborhood. But all right, what's next, Paul? All right, here's we're talking about the baking tradition, and this is the original Kern's Bakery. I'm glad to say the building is still there. This is, of course, the Oliver Hotel, and on the ground floor is Tupelo Honey, the restaurant. Kern's was a great place for food. In the back, he had his more serious industrial work going on, baking bread and making candy. But you could walk into the front here, and it was a candy store and a soda fountain. I think a lot of people had Coca-Cola for the first time from the soda fountain. In fact, we found a picture of the old soda fountain that's in the old city book you can actually see that he has about 40 different kinds of soda pop on tap, and one of them is Coca-Cola back in the 1880s or 90s. But the second floor was his ice cream saloon, and that was this elegant, lovely, romantic place with marble top tables and original art on the walls and chandeliers, where you could order ice cream until midnight. It was just a wonderful place to visit, the Kern's building. And Peter Kern, again, was one of these German refugees who came over after the revolutions of 1848, a very young man whose mother worried that he was going to be drafted into the prince's army, so she sent him to America, never to see him again, as far as I know. But they started a family that's still around today, and some of them are involved in food. They're connected to the Strong Stock Farm, some of the Kerns now. So it's a very interesting American immigrant family story. But there are other bakeries around. Kern's main competitor in town was Swan's Bakery. And I'm glad to say this building is still standing too on Magnolia. I'm not sure we know what is going to be there next, but it's a great old building built in the 1920s. And Swan's was notable for bread. They made Sunbeam white bread, but they were also known for black music. They especially for a group that they hired just kind of as a promotion for them, a gospel group called the Swan Silvertones. They were from West Virginia, moved to Knoxville to record and broadcast for Swan's Bread. And they were just a wonderful band. There's a guy named Claude Jeter, I think he was the main singer. But I heard an interview with Paul Simon recently, and confirming something that I'd heard. Paul Simon of Simon and Garfunkel said that he wrote "Bridge Over Troubled Waters." He was inspired by a song of Swan Silvertones. He says Swan Silvertones is his favorite American gospel band. So sometimes food, the influence of food crosses boundaries and into the musical sphere. And this is something that I think we should remember. Look up Swan Silvertones. There's several of their songs are on YouTube, but we should remember them better than we do. But there are lots of smaller bakeries. This is a place I'm glad is still standing. Charlie's Pie Shop. This was built in the cool old Art Deco style building. Built in the mid 1940s, and this was an industrial level pie shop. They claimed to make, I think, thousands of pies a day out of this building. It had a regional market, and there were lots of trucks, Charlie's Pie Shop trucks driving around, and I think they had some kind of a funny motto about "Don't bump us, we have pies" in the truck. But they were. Up and down Central seemed to be a place where Merida, and there were a lot of other bakeries there as well. And it's interesting that there's that resonance of that one street where there are bakeries, because of course Magpie's, the best one of the best bakeries in town, is on the same little strip there. But a few other things I want to talk about. I'm not sure we have slides for, but a lot of people ask about a few dishes that came out of Knoxville, especially Mets and beans. I got a question about that on email last week. What are Mets? Well, Mets are, the simple answer. Mets are it's short for Metwurst, and those a German sausage. And why Metwurst and not all these other German sausages? It's one of several kinds of sausages that were sold on Market Square. I mentioned earlier the Mettler fans and Ziegler company that made sausage. They were well known for sausage, but also there's a guy named Paul Macher, M-A-C-H-E-R, who was a little bit more extravagant than some in his marketing. Anyway, Paul Macher was a Market Square sausage maker from Germany, who made a Christmas tree every year purely out of 40 different kinds of sausage, a Christmas tree of 40 kinds of sausage. And he would raffle it off would you consider yourself lucky if you got a Christmas tree with 40 different kinds of sausage or not? And I don't know how long it would keep, but anyway, but he was one of these people that I'm sure had Metwurst and made Metwurst, this pork sausage that for some reason survived longer than any of the other many German sausages that were sold on Market Square. But by 1939, there was a place called Brownie's on Cumberland Avenue that sold Metwurst and beans. I don't know whether they invented this simple dish of just combining Metwurst and a plate of white beans, usually with onion, and best with hot sauce if you try it at home. But they became known for it, and Brownie's was the place, the same space that was later bought by a new company and opened it as the Old College Inn. And just as an homage to Brownie's, they sold for their entire existence, I think, sold Metwurst and beans there, Mets and beans. But there were several other places. The old Glenwood sandwich shop had Mets and beans. There was a place on Broadway that advertised just Mets and beans. I don't think they even had a name for the restaurant. It was called Mets and Beans here. But lots of the old line diner style of restaurants had Mets and beans all over downtown. And it's a rare remnant of this German immigrant heritage, I think. Another thing is the steamed deli sandwich. This is something that people talk about a lot. Our steamed deli sandwich is unique to Knoxville. I've looked into it, and I don't think so, but they're unusual. I think they're more common or were more common 20 or 30 years ago. I had this romantic idea that steamed sandwiches which are Sam and Andy's made especially famous. Sam and Andy's, the original ones on the Strip. The Sam and Andy they were both Greek immigrants. They were both hat makers and hat refurbishers, and they would have had steamers and a hat shop. So I would like, my idea was that maybe they started using these steamers for their sandwiches too. But I found an interview with a later generation at Sam and Andy's in the 1960s, when they said, we just got the idea from a little restaurant out in the country between here and Asheville that steamed their sandwiches, and we kind of liked it, so we started doing it at our place, and it caught on with a lot of other delis in town. I think if you got a deli sandwich in Knoxville 25 years ago, it was more likely than not that it was steamed. There are still a few places that do that. Another thing is the Pigburger. This is something that is partly a remnant, is at least connected to the German heritage in a way, a surprising way. But a place called Brother Jack's in Mechanicsville on University Avenue was run for many years. I think it was opened first in the 1920s. Ran for many years. I remember it well. Was there for at least 60 years, 60, 70 years. But was they had all sorts of barbecue. They had barbecue chicken, and if you got a barbecue chicken sandwich, you got the whole half a chicken with the bones and everything, with a couple pieces of white bread, which is fine with me. But they had pulled pork barbecue, but they also had the Pigburger, which was their own invention. It was a pork and beef burger combined together. And we showed Dixon's because Dixon's barbecue had the Pigburger for after Brother Jack's closed and after Brother Jack died. But that was the best place to get Pigburgers 10 years ago, and I'm sorry it's closed and been vanished since then. But there's the connection to Germans was that the original Brother Jack, who is the father of the Brother Jack that many of us remember, had worked with German butchers on Market Square and might have picked up a few things from them. They might have picked up a few things from him too. But there's an interesting connection with the German immigrant culture as well. But the Pigburger, do we have a little clip, Paul, to play about the Pigburger?
I've journeyed to Knoxville, Tennessee, a scenic city at the foot of the Great Smoky Mountains, to take on the Gigante Challenge. But before my 5-pound showdown, I'm sampling a succulent sandwich you can't get anywhere else. I'm on Magnolia Avenue in Knoxville at Dixon's Barbecue. And while you're used to seeing me with a big burger, today I'm having a Pigburger. Juicy pork patties made from rib trimmings, topped with steamed onions, and Dixon's legendary barbecue sauces. No lettuce, no tomato, no other toppings, because on this Pigburger, that's all, folks. Located in East Tennessee, Knoxville has a barbecue tradition that borrows from both North Carolina and Memphis. But the Pigburger is a K-Town original. And since 1989, locals have stepped up to this barbecue shack's counter to order what they say is the best in the city. If I want an authentic Knoxville Pigburger, where do I go?
Dixon's. Dixon's Barbecue.
I'm served in the Army, and I've been all around the world eating. And when I come back home, I got to have me a Dixon's Pigburger. Man, it just be right.
What's the key ingredient?
Love. You can taste the onion.
I can taste the love. The Pigburger was dreamed up by a local barbecue guru called Mr. Jack in 1922. Today, it can be found all over the city. In the kitchen, owner Toby Dixon shows me his interpretation of the Knoxville classic. All right, well, will you make me a proper Pigburger?
I'll make you a Pigburger.
Let's do it.
All right.
Toby begins by seasoning ground pork that's been hand-cut from Dixon's legendary ribs. I feel like we're going to do 3-card Monty here. All right, which one's got the seasoning? Which one's got the seasoning? Keep your eye on the cup. Keep your eye on the cup. Look at me, don't look at me, don't look at me. Look at Toby, look at Toby. He's got a nice head, he's got a nice head. And, okay, boom. What do we have in this?
This is sugar, this is spice, and this is everything nice, and that's what I put in it. That's what I tell people.
Oh, I like that. With the secret seasonings mixed in, Toby sculpts out the patties. We have 6 burgers on a dry skillet. What do we add next for the cooking process?
I'm going to add a little bit of water.
Water, kind of steam them up a little bit.
Steam them up.
While the burgers steam, Toby cuts up a sweet Vidalia onion, topping off each burger with a thick slice.
So the onion juices are cooking into the pork juices are cooking into the onion, so it's the one cohesive flavor of everything.
Right.
Oh, look at that.
Toby places the burger between two slices of white bread, pouring on generous doses of hot and sweet barbecue sauces.
It's that black gold right there.
That's black gold?
Yeah.
I thought that's what they called you.
Well, they used to till I got married.
So here is my beautiful pig burger. An unbelievable, handmade, true taste of Knoxville, true taste of the Dixon family. That's awesome.
Thank you.
As you take a bite, the sauce mixes in. And so it doesn't become overwhelming. And the soft crunch of the onion kind of sets it over the top. And what I also like is your seasonings kind of accentuate the meat. It's a good, simple sandwich. You have a winner right here.
I appreciate it.
I'm sorry to say that Mr. Dixon was killed in a car wreck a couple of years after that, but that was it's a loss to me, at least. I used to love to pop by Dixon's, but anyway, that's one plausible option as a Knoxville original. But another one has to do with a guy named Harry Royston that I mentioned briefly, and it has to do with the story of the tamale. Tamales have been kind of a fascination for me because I grew up with tamales. I remember the first Mexican restaurant in Knoxville, but tamales were not new. Tamales have been around Knoxville for a long time. We didn't have a Mexican restaurant until about 1970 in Knoxville, and but we definitely had tamales before that because it was on Market Square. There was an old man that sold tamales on Market Square, and I once asked him where did he learn how to do this, and thinking he would say something about Mexico. He said, no, my aunt taught me how to make tamales, and she I don't know where she did her whole life, and I was puzzled about this, and why did we have tamales and we didn't have tacos? But I began looking back and finding evidence that we had tamales. There were restaurants that featured tamales back in the 30s, and back in the even farther back in the city directories, like around 1908, 1910. There's actually a separate listing where it has like harness makers and jewelers and stuff. It has tamale manufacturers. There's a tamale manufacturer category in the city directories back then. And I had an idea for a while that it might have come from the 1904 World's Fair, because I heard that there were tamales at that World's Fair in St. Louis, and a lot of Knoxvillians went there. But no, I followed it farther back, and with help from some friends who found clues here and there. Wes Morgan, I think, helped with this a little bit, but there was I heard about this guy named Harry Royston, who was arrived here in Knoxville in 1887, and had traveled a lot in his life. He had been a circus carny, and he picked up a lot of stuff along the way. And he came here and he started cooking tamales, making tamales in Knoxville, and first selling them from a push cart, then from his own little cafe in the old Cripple Creek area, just east of the old city. And then he made a small factory for tamales. And he had a kind of a sing-song chant that he would shout, both in the black and white parts of town. Said, they're hot, they're Harry's, get them now. And he would sell them in the black community, and he would sell them up in the white community. We even sell tamales to people coming out of the Opera House in the 1880s and 90s. And but he's the guy that started this tamale thing, at least here in Knoxville. And it kind of caught on. Other people tried to do it, tried their own styles of tamales. But today we still have tamales. Let's look at some of the other pictures we have of tamales across the ages. Oh, by the way, I didn't mention this is from the 1910 exposition, the Negro Building. This was built by black people, a lot of them connected to Knoxville College. For the big exposition, they had these. I think in all three of the expositions, the Negro Building was there. But over to the left, there's a tamale restaurant. If you look, it's a place that's advertising tamales, and that's part of this African American tamale tradition here in town. It says hot tamales and wienerwurst, and wienerwurst is what we called what we were soon to call hot dogs, or in fact, some people think the phrase hot dog was first used in Knoxville to describe what had been called wienerwurst. But ice
Hey,
cream,
Jack.
yeah, Paul.
I noticed on the word, it also says Harry's Stand. Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, it
Harry's
is.
Stand.
Yeah. Harry Royston. I'm sure that's
Yeah,
the guy.
That's probably him.
Yeah, with some what look like question marks. It's interesting. But tamale 5 cents. I wish I could. I've got a nickel here. I wish I could spend it there. But anyway, yeah, it's we have with Paul's help, we found several historic tamale shots. This is a well-known picture of the old Biltmore Cafe, and this is on Union Avenue near Market Square. In fact, if you go in the alley, you can still see, I think, the Moore at the end of the Biltmore name. They were here from the 1920s to the 1940s. The Greek family, Anagnos family, ran this place until the mid 1940s, and they decided to try the motel business and moved out to Bearden and opened the Biltmore Motel in Bearden. But here you see it says eat more good food, and this is red hots, which are hot dogs, chili, and tamales. And this chili and tamales, we see that linked a lot in years to come. And I love this picture. It has I've wondered if this picture was taken like the day that they legalized beer in Tennessee, because you have all these waitresses out on the street with a policeman, and they're drinking beer. They wouldn't be able to do that today. You can't drink beer on the street. But the two owner managers are standing there, and they're all having a good time there on a sunny day on Union Avenue. What's next, Paul? All right, here's an interesting early ad for it appears to be for fried oysters, but there is also a mention of new jelly roll tamales, cold weather goodies, new jelly roll tamales. In those days, tamales were kind of a seasonal specialty. It was something you didn't eat except in cold weather. A lot of places would not begin serving them until about this time of year. Made by an original method of putting several generous layers of tasty meat throughout the tamale. Try them. Hot chocolate and hot chili, and hamburgers, hash burgers, big steaming full house. You see that phrase, full house? This is from, I can't make out that date, Paul. Is it 1930, 37 or something?
35.
35, okay. But it says, this is, I think, the earliest reference to the full house that we've seen. And the full house, what is a full house? Order full house in any other city in America, I'm not sure they would know what you're asking for. But today there are still 2 or 3 restaurants at least, maybe more than that, where you can order full house and get a bowl of chili with at least 1 tamale in it, and often some onions or something on the side. But anyway, interesting early documentation of the full house. But what's next? All right, here's another shot of an early from 1938. Homemade hot tamales or chili and a full house. They didn't. They just assumed that everybody would know what a full house was. It was tamale with chili, and there were lots of poker players in Knoxville. They must have enjoyed that reference back in those days. This was one of the sports bars, by the way. This is probably all male walk-up bars where you could bet on sporting events, and they would have you go up and watch Ruth and Gehrig and the Yankees or whatever, and play ball and bet on the scores on a big chalkboard that often the bartender would note who was winning the bets. but they would sit there and have a beer and eat a full house. And there's another picture I'd never seen before today, a picture of a tamale, a Chilean tamale place that was on the 200 block of Gay Street, which was the block that unfortunately is not there anymore. But if you can see the hot tamales, hamburgers, hot dogs, chili, steaks and chops. But the Presto Sandwich Shop, I'm not familiar with that. If anybody remembers the Presto Sandwich Shop, let me know. But this is an early 20th century place that I would like to know more about. Looks like this might be after it closed, perhaps. But all right, and even Kaz Walker got in on the hot tamales and chili thing, and it shows you how you don't have to go to the Presto Sandwich Shop. You can get a full house at the Kaz Walker store by putting all these things together: Van Camp's chili, Van Camp's hot tamales, and Sunshine crispy crackers, and a real treat on chilly days, a full house. Kaz Walker was all for giving people what they wanted without having to go downtown, which he didn't like much anyway. So he liked the idea of people buying stuff at his stores and taking it home and making them. But here's a picture, kind of funny. It was a night that Kaz Walker and Perry Como were both going to be on TV the same night. And he thought Kaz and Como, whatever was popular, Kaz was for latching on to. But here you see that last leaf down at the bottom has something about the chili and tamales. Let's go back to the other picture that has it says chili with beans, saltine, crackers, hot tamales. The same thing. Yeah, crackers are also an elemental part of a full house. But anyway, just the two Mr. C's, Kaz and Como. That just kind of tickles me to see Kaz Walker aligning himself with the very suave and relaxing singer of the day. Yeah, here's a closer picture of that lower leaf with the chili special. All right, here's the Smoky Mountain Market, a well-known place on Chapman Highway. I used to actually walk across the Henley Street Bridge. It was still there until 10 years ago or so, and they had a full house. They sold a full house. They also had boiled eggs and all sorts of things that you could get just on the over the counter there in the Smoky Mountain Market. We specialize in full house and hot tamales and the tastiest hot dogs in town. Yeah, they seem to go together. Oldest 24-hour market in the South. It's a place a lot of people remember fondly, as we have learned recently through social media. All right. And here's one of the places that still serves full houses, mainly in cold weather. I bet the original Frizo has hot tamales. They don't have any indoor seating. It's just like a beach place or something. You walk up and order your food, and there's a couple of concrete outside tables that I've had many a full house on myself. But it's a cool place. So it's on the edge of Happy Holler in North Central there. This place has been there since the early 1950s, I believe. This, like it or not, this is one of the oldest restaurants in Knoxville today. But they're hanging in there. But it's a cool place, a bit of a memory from long ago. But also you can get tamales at well-known Good Golly Tamale in the old city. And I love the residence. The Good Golly is very close to where Harry Royston started his tamale empire, just beyond, about a block away from there. But I want to close with, anyways, it's still a challenge. We have a great food history and lots of interesting traditions. A challenge to think that there's something that we can make. Can we make a Knoxville dish? I tried to do this when I worked at Metrobus, challenge chefs to come up with a Knoxville dish, a typically Knoxville dish. And they all really responded heartily with some really great dishes, but they were all really complicated, not easy to replicate, except for Mahasty, who made a pizza with kudzu on it, which was, I think, would be kind of easy to replicate or do some kind of version of it at your home. Kudzu is edible. It's not bad. But I want to close with a quote that I just heard this week from a well-known celebrity chef named Alton Brown, who has been in Knoxville. And this is another thing that makes me think that we should have some kind of culinary tradition, because we've been the home of the Food Network for many years. But he was here doing a national one of his national shows, and he remarked about what kind of a city Knoxville is. Alton Brown lives in the Atlanta area, I believe. I think he was born in Los Angeles, but he lives in the Atlanta area. He said, Knoxville is a wonderful town with amazing people, great architecture, and more city life than Atlanta has. This is a real city, not a town. Atlanta is a big town. Knoxville is a small city. Anyway, I'll take that. But anyway, that's my talk about culinary history. And I know I've skipped a lot of things, but I'd love to hear what you all might have to have to say about your memories of anything that might have a spark of something original about them in Knoxville culinary history. Are there any questions or comments or stories or recipes, perhaps?
I always thought that S&W cafeteria was a special place.
It was, yeah.
And then there was fine dining at the Crystal Hamburgers for 11 cents for a hamburger.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, S&W
Blue
was
Circle was 25 cents.
Yeah, S&W was a small chain, but didn't feel like a chain. It was out of North Carolina. I think they never had more than 7 or 8 locations, but they had one in Washington D.C. and one in Knoxville. But it was the one that we remember was built in 1937, and it was an Art Deco cafeteria. And a lot of people, it's hard to explain to kids. The cafeterias could be elegant, and they kind of it was kind of an elegant place. It had the big sweeping spiral staircase, and they had the organist, his name was Lois Harris, who played kind of the hits of the day. But I don't remember the food all that much. I remember getting Salisbury steak and that sort of thing. But it was just a great experience to be there. 4 stories in all, in interior levels of that place, including the mezzanine. But it was a great old place.
The people who live downtown, like my grandmother at the Glencoe, they had basically reserved areas at the S&W, and the men who carried your plates, your trays for you, would never sit anybody in like a 5-table area of the people who lived downtown and ate there every afternoon at about 4:30.
Yeah. Well, it's got a lot of history. And if you just think about all the people who were, everybody from the original TVA directors, David Lilienthal and Arthur Morgan, most people, but also Coach Neely and all the country music stars who were coming through town. There's so many interesting people were there and ran into each other now and then. There's a story about John R. Neal, the famous attorney who was involved with the Scopes trial and all these things, and how he once got his Cormac McCarthy tells a story in his novel how he was very simple, and when his leather belt broke, he started tying his pants up with a rope, and one day while he was carrying his tray to his table, his rope came undone and he stood there with his pants falling around his ankles. And of course, John R. Neal didn't wear underwear, but so this was kind of an embarrassing turn of events for the well-known lawyer. But yeah, S&W appears in literature like Cormac McCarthy's Suttree as well. But yeah, it's a quite, and honestly, I'm sorry S&W is not there anymore, but the Aveda people have done a good job with keeping the integrity of the interior of that building. It's still a pretty building inside, and you can kind of tell it's something special.
How did Pete's become a local gathering spot for local politicians?
Pete's has just been, it's a remnant of many cafes beginning back in the 1920s. You can kind of trace the lineage of it. Pete's himself has been there for 35 or 40 years. But I think just the fact that it is well known has become kind of an institution. I think when Bill Haslam announced his run for the governor's office, he did it at Pete's, the statewide run there, and Pete's, I guess before that had already been a place where people expected to see big shot lawyers and judges and stuff without having to spend too much money. But it's something about those. I think politicians are attracted to those old to the old places with a lot of tradition to them. Pizza was originally, when I first started going to pizza, was in the old Sprinkle building, which was torn down, and that was the original location that had been what had been Weaver's Cafe and many other things in the deep past, back to the 20s. So Pete's, I think, carried some of that tradition with him to the new building. Yeah, it really is a gathering place for almost everybody. Even Harrison Ford showed up there a year or two ago. So it's you never know who you're going to see at Pete's.
Well, Pete was a neighbor of ours in Crestwood Hills for a number of years.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, Pete Latour, that's his last name, right? But yeah, he's a good guy.
We have several restaurants that you haven't mentioned that were favorites when we were younger. Ollie's Trolley and their Ollie burgers were some of the best hamburgers I've ever had.
Yeah, believe it or not, there's still at least one Ollie's Trolley in Washington, D.C. I went there about 5 years ago, and it kind of brought back memories. Ollie's Trolley was on Cumberland Avenue back in the 70s, I guess.
Yeah.
And and had just amazing French fries with that unusual spice on them.
Right.
The spice,
I think it originated in Louisville, and there's we ran into a brick and mortar version up there in Louisville on one of our trips after it closed here in Knoxville.
Yeah.
Let's see, another place that was of interest was the L&N Hotel before the World's Fair opened up. And it was a flop house that crew from trains would stay at. And it was converted to a very rustic restaurant for a number of years. And my coworkers and I used to enjoy going down there for a Friday lunch and a liquid refreshment back before fitness for duty requirements would restrict us from doing that. But their Oriental food and their spiders, it was shredded sweet potato, deep fried in an Oriental type batter. Tremendous.
Yeah. I had forgotten about those. Yeah, I think there was if I'm not mistaken, there was a Chinese fellow who was a partner in that business. But yeah, I took a few dates there in college. That was I missed the L&N too.
Of course, when the World's Fair opened, a lot of the pavilions had the cuisine of the host nation, and we had season passes, and very many Friday nights, Linda and I would go to eat in one of the restaurants. We might go in a pavilion or two and just sit and watch all the people. And that was a favorite pastime of ours for the 10 months the fair was open.
6 months, yeah.
Do you have any history on Wade's Bakery?
I've never. We have it mentioned, at least in the Bearden book, but I did not do a deep history on that. Wade's Bakery was mainly known for birthday cakes, in my memory at least. I don't know if they made bread and that sort of thing too, but
our girls loved the thumbprint cookies there.
Oh yeah. Wade's was in Bearden Center. Yeah.
Of course, we lived in West Knoxville most of our adult lives. Steak and Ale on Kingston Pike was a restaurant that we were very fond of. And of course, it was closed and became a car lot for Ice Oils. And we were very sad when that disappeared. Ran into one of their restaurants out in Albuquerque, I think it was, on a business trip that was still open some years later. And of course, Shakey's Pizza near West Town Mall. It's probably my favorite place. They had I think it was under the crust, they had some cornbread crumbs, and the sauce had a sweetness to it. It was very unique, and it was my favorite pizza, and hated when that closed down.
And it was a fun place to go to. They had ragtime music there all the time, and like Dixieland, but it was there before West Town. It was probably the only fun thing to do past Bearden was Shakey's Pizza in the 60s.
Yeah, they had old silent movies and all kinds of stuff going on there.
Yeah.
Very entertaining place. The kids enjoyed it too.
Yeah. Yeah, chains are relevant to the story, and Knoxville has played a hand in several chains. It's interesting that there's, I think there's still some, Grady Riga started a chain called Grady's, and it, I think still exists in some parts of the country, but it not in his hometown anymore. It was sold to one person after another, I think, and is still a respected restaurant in Texas and other places. But
I remember Eula's downtown, Eula's Meat and Three.
I remember seeing that. I don't know if I ever went there or not. Eula's. I'll have to look that up.
It moved about, I think, about 3 different places.
Yeah.
Until it finally went out of business.
What were they, Meat and Three? Anything in particular that you remember? Any particular meat or vegetable or whatever that?
No, it was one of those places that had specials every day, and
yeah.
But they had several things that you could order.
Yeah.
But it's a lunch place essentially.
Do you remember who had the brass rail downtown? Who run that?
I don't remember right now. I remember the place, and
George and Gus Greeks, of course. And
yeah.
Were they not Perulis or something? Were they or?
I believe you're right. And they had mutton beans for one of their daily specials. You had fish on Friday, of course.
Fish, and the best fish and the best slaw. I don't know what kind of slaw they used. A vinegar in it, and didn't have mayonnaise in it. It had vinegar type thing. It was delicious.
And they had short ribs for another day.
Yeah.
Well, I the last time I was in there, I saw a famous person go in there and followed him in and caught him inside right before he got his table and got Lionel Hampton's autograph. Lionel Hampton was eating at the Brass Rail about 40 years ago, I guess. He was going to play at the Tennessee Theater across the street that night.
Somebody explained to me, I was introduced when I moved to Knoxville back late in the 20th century to the Meat and Two. I'd always had Meat and Three until I moved to Knoxville, and it seems like Meat and Two is more popular here.
Well, sometimes
Just
Meat
cheap,
and Two.
it's just cheap.
Yeah,
cheap, yeah.
That's right.
Economy, stupid.
Yeah. Sometimes the bread goes without saying. Meat and Two plus bread. Sometimes people might count the cornbread roll or something as part of the 3.
No, back in South Carolina, you got Meat and Three and the cornbread.
Okay, well, just move back to South Carolina then, Brent. Right. Any other memories or comments or demands? All right. We appreciate your coming out, and happy Thanksgiving to everybody.